Alcatraz may be one of the most famous prisons to ever exist in the United States of America, even over half a decade past its closure. The Rock, as it's been termed, has housed villains such as Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, and its geographic position has helped to shape its reputation as one of the most dreaded and inescapable prisons to ever be built. Almost, if not every American, knows about the now supposedly haunted prison on the California Bay Area island, but one fact that seems less known is that Alcatraz was at one point under an unexpected occupation. The occupation of Alcatraz is part of a past that is deeply intertwined with the history of America's indigenous population. While we don't have time for a full rundown of their history, let's just say that what we're taught about the relationship between the colonists and natives in school is very, very watered down, if not wholly historically inaccurate at times. In reality, colonial empires did as colonial empires did, and the British colonists in America had one goal for the natives: assimilate or eradicate. And this mindset often continued for some people or organizations, even into modern history, as we found out with the recent boarding school discoveries. So it's fair to say that by the end of the mid to late 20th century, the Native Americans in the US were pretty fed up. When Alcatraz closed down in 1963, the local indigenous population had already been trying to make some type of headway in their work to reclaim the island, which had historically been used by the natives themselves. Pointing to the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie that allowed Native Americans to claim federal lands which were no longer in use, some activists began to aim to do just that with the Rock. The first attempt came in the spring of 1964, when a handful of natives landed on the island, led by Richard Mackenzie, but this only lasted for a few hours. Nonetheless, this would prove to be a significant act in galvanizing other local natives, and the group's demands for Alcatraz to be turned into a school and cultural center remained a rallying cry for the indigenous movement to follow. The next attempt at occupation came on November 9, 1969, when Richard Oakes led another group of natives to the island, but this occupation lasted only one night before the group was forcibly removed by authorities. By this point, though, the indigenous people of the Bay Area were ready for some lasting change. In October of that year, a fire had decimated San Francisco's American Indian Center, which gave the natives just one more reason for demanding the use of Alcatraz as a replacement. Willing to put up a fight for this idea, another wave of natives landed on the Rock again on November 20th after crossing the bay in the dark of night with 89 men, women, and children in total. This occupation went quite differently than the last two. Once on the island, the natives claimed the land for all indigenous of all tribes across North America. They swiftly began to enter and utilize the buildings to set up a makeshift little town and marked walls of the prison with graffiti, some of which can still be seen today. They then soon made their first public proclamation, which officially announced their goal of turning the prison into a school and cultural center, and made an offer to the Great White Father and all his people to buy the island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth. Obviously, a sarcastic jab at the original colonists who supposedly purchased Manhattan for this exact amount. This was the first well-organized occupation attempt so far, and the natives set up a working system and community so quickly that the government was unsure of how to respond. At first, the government attempted to pressure the natives to leave, but eventually shifted focus when the latter demanded that formal negotiations be started. The government also feared an immense backlash if they decided to end the occupation by force, as not only were more natives congregating on the island, but even non-indigenous Americans, including celebrities such as Jane Fonda and Anthony Quinn, were beginning to show support for the native cause. Still, this was a problem for the government, since the natives would not back down on their demands for the island, and the government would not compromise on any of it. By now, hundreds of inhabitants had established a real functioning town on the island with a working administration, school, clinic, and more. Activists and everyday Americans began sending supplies to the island for the natives in the form of food, money, and clothing, and a boat was even donated by the famous band Creedence Clearwater. Sadly though, by midway through 1970, life on the island had started to decline. Many of the initial occupiers had to return to school, and a new wave of residents who were more interested in living rent-free as opposed to fighting for the cause began to use up the island's resources. When Richard Oakes, the original organizer, had to leave following the death of his stepdaughter on the island, the administrative structure began to self-implode. Simultaneously, the US government was quietly waiting things out and taking a stance of non-interference, aside from shutting off power to the island and removing their water barge. Only a few days later, a fire broke out and destroyed several buildings across the Rock. With administrative issues, a new drug problem, despite drugs originally being banned from the island, new counterproductive residents, and subtle governmental pressure increasing, the occupation was going downhill and finally fell apart in the spring of 1971. Only a handful of occupiers remained, and the government entered the island in early June, claiming that they needed to repair the foghorn and lighthouse after an oil tanker crash on the bay, and they removed the few remaining residents. While the occupation itself may have ended in defeat for the natives, it was overall actually a success for the movement. The American population had had become more aware of the ongoing fight of the indigenous, and the government was forced to soften its policies toward them. 50 legislative proposals were passed in an effort to give more sovereignty back to the indigenous, millions of acres of native lands were returned, and President Nixon himself said that the time has come for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. Alcatraz would be reopened a few years later as a national park and tourist attraction, not as a native cultural center or school, but nonetheless, its once 19-month occupation would remain an important period in the history of America, and even in many ways, a strong motivation for the indigenous movements that exist to this day.